Well, now that I've regained my composure, most of you probably realize that I do have a mother who loves to prank me even when I'm working. So, moving along. One of the first elements of the business government society field, as I was saying, is a business. Now, a business is any sort of profit making activity. Now, of course, we can define profit in a variety of ways. Sometimes you might look at it in terms of economic profit, just plain old dollars and cents. That's the most common measure. This is what our friends who are accountants would say is profit. But then there's also for what we might call psychic income, intrinsic profit. These are things like where you perform a certain kind of activity in exchange for feeling good. But we'll get a little bit more into that once we start talking about corporate social responsibility and creating shared value later on in this course. The second group that we're going to look at is government. So we can define government as any sort of reified or concrete series of structures and processes that society has in some way created, and these sorts of organizations or these elements authoritatively create rules and laws. So they kind of impose their will on everyone else, but in theory they are at least responsible to their constituents, their people. The next factor, of course, is society. This is a network of human relations composed of ideas, institutions, and material things. We'll talk about what those mean in just a second. But it's basically, we are all members of society, a society. So, of course, we're all members of a government. We're all citizens of a country. And of course, we all participate in business activity to some extent. So these are kind of overlapping. Every single person deals with one of these three actors in the business government society field in one way or another. And we also have an idea. And we would define an idea as an intangible object of thought. What would an intangible object of thought be? Well, how about something like goodness, wholesomeness? These are good examples of ideas. You can usually not define an idea per se, yet you can recognize when an idea is taking place. If I were to ask you what is good, and I asked a variety of people that, what is goodness, we might all say, well, it's fluffy kittens, or it's a great bottle of wine, or you might give different answers, and they may not be the same answer. But at the same time, we can all recognize something that is an embodiment of goodness when we see it, even if our actual definitions are quite different in a given moment. And we've also got values. So values are enduring beliefs about which kinds of choices are correct. Think of, for example, the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not kill. That is a general guiding principle. Don't kill people. That's kind of an example of that. We've also got ideology. Ideology is a bundle of values that creates a particular view of the world. Ideology are systems of beliefs. Think of things like Christianity, Marxism. These kinds of ideologies embody a whole slew of actually values and ideas, and they provide kind of a concrete roadmap of how you should behave in a variety of everyday situations. Institution. Institutions are formal patterns of relations that link people to accomplish any sort of a goal. These are the kind of larger macro generalizations of organizations. We'll talk about what some of those institutions are in just a second. And of course, we have material things. These are kind of tangible artifacts that exist in society and that more or less shape and are shaped by ideas and institutions. So material things, in some way, are products of institutions, but they also they embody values and ideologies. Let's give a couple of examples. Think about how the American flag represents the institutions of America. When you see an American flag, you probably think about certain aspects of American society. Think about, for example, when you see a person having, for example, a fancy iPhone or a fancy iPad. You can assume certain things about that person based on their choices of material artifacts. Think about the way people dress or their shoes. You can somehow make assumptions about that person's values and ideologies based on the clothing choices that they wear. So material objects are things that you can touch. We'll talk about that a little bit later in this course as well. So, what are some examples of institutions? Well, we've got a variety of them. And all of these institutions support the market. The market is a reflection of the institutions that basically form the foundations of the market itself. So of course we've got the media. The media is almost anything you can think of. Think of the internet, the newspaper, television, radio, and they inform the public, and in many ways, media images can stimulate commerce and growth with advertising. We've got corporations. Corporations are these large, publicly owned or publicly traded institutions that combine capital and labor. They encourage investment by limiting risk and liability, and they typically are, in the terms of the law, defined as people. However, these people, these corporate people, will have a lifespan much longer than any real human being. So we have financial institutions. Financial institutions are things like banks, things like national banks, and they mobilize capital for saving, for borrowing, and for lending. We have the judicial institutions. And the judicial institutions are basically the courts, and they protect property rights, one of the most important aspects of business, government, and society. They encourage investment by having formal dispute resolution mechanisms. We have regulatory institutions. Regulatory institutions protect the public and investors from dishonesty, from danger, and from fraud. These are all the consumer protection agencies, for example, that we'll talk about a little bit later in this course. We have political institutions. Political institutions make economic policy. They are those institutions that collect taxes. They provide basic social safety nets. When I talk about social safety nets, we'll talk about that a little later in this course, but in a rudimentary sense, you're thinking about things like Social Security, welfare, unemployment insurance. Those are Medicare and Medicaid. Those are good examples. And they provide us an essential check and balance on business power. And then you've got cultural institutions. Cultural institutions are those kinds of institutions that impart values, habits, and norms in families, and religious, or educational institutions. So cultural institutions, the most common one that I think of is the church. The church dictates a certain way of behavior. It serves as a guide. Certain cultural organizations can also be cultural institutions. Think of fraternities or sports teams. They have certain cultures that they impart on their members. So I've talked about these different actors in the business, government, society field. Now let's ask a big question. Who cares? What's the point of all this? Well, if you want to be successful in business, and particularly as a manager, you don't need to be responsive only to business interest, but you also need to be responsive to the economic and the non-economic environment that exists outside of your firm or your organization. Okay? So if you're a business, you need to understand your customers. In order to understand your customers, you have to look at what institutions in business, government, and society do they partake in? And what does that mean for their buying habits? How does that make them customers? You also have to look at, for example, your suppliers. How do their values impact your organization? How do political actors impact your organization? These are all very, very important. So you need to understand that markets are important, but also social impacts are critical for business success. Of course, in the words of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, there's also what we may call the social contract. And the social contract exists between economic institutions and other networks in society. Rousseau is known for saying that man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. What that means is, yes, in theory, we are not restricted. But when we interact with others, these chains start to bind us in some way. And so even though we think that we are a free society, we are nonetheless bound by actors from business, government, and society who both constrain and enable our behavior. It's important to understand how these constraints and affordances work in your role as a manager.